There is a weight that no one can see, but that drags along those who live in the shadow of fear. A weight that has no form, yet it presses on the chest, burns the soul and stifles thoughts. That's how I began that day, with a nameless anguish, a knot in my throat that I knew all too well. Since childhood, I was taught that any doubt was a failure, that any slip, no matter how small, could cost me eternity. I grew up with the feeling of always being on the edge of an abyss. One wrong step and I'd fall straight into hell. But that day, something was different. The guilt seemed greater, denser, as if something or someone was watching me, waiting for me to fail. The clock struck 3 a.m. when I awoke with my heart racing. I didn't know if I had dreamed or if something had woken me, but an inexplicable fear took hold of me. The silence of the room seemed to have its own sound, like an almost imperceptible humming, something that filled the space between my thoughts. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. All I could feel was a presence, something that wasn't physically there, yet I knew it existed. And then the thought emerged, cruel and relentless. What if I'm not really saved? My hands were sweating and my chest heaved in a disjointed rhythm. I had heard that question before, countless times in the impassioned sermons at church. Are you sure of your salvation? It was a doubt instilled in us from a young age, a fear that kept us always submissive, always returning for more confessions, more fasts, more promises. But there, alone in the darkness, that question wasn't just a phrase repeated by the pastor. It was a cold blade cutting through my mind, leaving a trail of terror. What if I had committed an unforgivable sin without realizing it? What if my faith had never been enough? I began to remember every mistake, every impure thought, every moment of hesitation. Panic turned into despair. I felt that I needed to do something, anything, to quell that terror. I got out of bed, feeling my legs trembling, and walked over to the mirror. My reflection looked strange, as if my own eyes were judging me. I knelt right there on the cold floor of my room and began to whisper a frantic prayer. It wasn't a prayer of peace or gratitude. It was a desperate plea, a supplication for God to give me some certainty, some sign that I was not lost. But the more I tried to pray, the emptier I felt. The words left my mouth like meaningless echoes, phrases I had repeated so many times that they had lost their weight. And then the memory came. The pastor used to say that if our prayer wasn't heard, it was because we had sinned in our lives. Something hidden, something impure. A shiver ran up my spine. Could that be it? Had God withdrawn from me? My thoughts spun in circles faster and faster, and the fear began to transform into something darker. It wasn't just the possibility of hell that scared me, but the idea that perhaps I was already condemned, that it was already too late. I tried to recall something that would bring me comfort, a verse, a teaching that could dissipate that dread, but my mind was dominated by another memory, the revival meetings I attended in my teenage years. I remember how the pastor spoke about people who thought they were saved, but who, on Judgment Day, would be cast aside. He always quoted Matthew 7:23, "Away from me, you evildoers." At the time, that already sent shivers down my spine. But now, sitting on the floor of my room, it hit me like a sentence. What if I were one of them? What if I had been mistaken all along? The fear consumed me, and without realizing it, I began to cry. It wasn't just sadness. It was the feeling of being lost, of having been deceived by my own faith. So many times I'd been told that God is love, but why could I only feel terror? Why did my faith, instead of setting me free, imprison me in an endless cycle of guilt and anguish? I got up and walked around the room, feeling my heart pounding in my throat. I grabbed my Bible and opened it at random, hoping to find some answer, some word that could pull me out of that hole. My eyes fell on a passage from Romans 8:15. "For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." My chest tightened. How many times had I read that verse without truly understanding it? I wasn't supposed to be in fear. I wasn't meant to feel like a slave to fear, but the truth was, I didn't know how to free myself. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push the anguish away. But then another thought came. What if this feeling of relief was just another deception? What if the devil was trying to calm me so that I would lower my guard? A new wave of dread hit me. I no longer knew whom to trust, not even myself. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands over my face, trying to contain the trembling that overtook my body. I needed to get out of there, to breathe, to push away those thoughts before they completely swallowed me. I put on a coat and left into the street with no set destination, just letting my feet guide me. The cold pre-dawn wind cut through my skin, but it was a relief to feel something physical, something real, something that wasn't that storm inside my head. The streets were deserted, and every sound echoed like a distorted whisper. I remembered how, as a child, I was told that the devil walked at night, seeking wavering souls. That idea made me quicken my pace. I no longer knew what was paranoia and what was truth. All I knew was that something inside me was screaming, begging for answers. My steps led me to the church. It was a simple building with white walls and a cross illuminated at the top. I had spent so many nights inside, kneeling, asking for forgiveness for sins I wasn't even sure I had committed. But for the first time, I hesitated to enter. I stood before the closed door, watching the darkness through the stained glass windows. I knew that if I entered, I would hear the same speeches, the same promises of condemnation, the same guilt that had haunted me for so long. But what if it was there that I would find my answer? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Isn't God supposed to be everywhere? Then why did I feel that if I didn't step into that building, I'd be lost? Fear paralyzed me. If I couldn't feel God's presence outside those walls, had I ever really known him? My hands were cold as I touched the church door's handle. It yielded easily, and the sound of the hinge echoed in the silence of the early morning. Inside, the air was heavy, laden with the smell of old wood and extinguished candles. The empty pews seemed to watch me as I walked down the central aisle, each step resonating like an unspoken confession. I knelt on the first pew and closed my eyes, trying to find something within me that would bring peace. But all I found was silence, a silence that swallowed me up, that made me feel small, insignificant. Was God listening to me, or had he already given up on me? The fear began to grow in my chest again. I remembered the pastor saying that those who stray from the faith don't realize when they lose their salvation. And what if that silence was proof that I was already condemned? My mind spun in a spiral, and without noticing, I began to whisper a prayer. Not the memorized words I repeated every week, but a sincere, almost desperate plea. Lord, if you are still with me, give me a sign. I waited. Nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, and doubt turned into absolute terror. Perhaps I had committed the sin that cannot be forgiven. Perhaps I was one of those who would hear the most dreaded words of the Bible, I never knew you. My eyes burned with contained tears. Despair grew. And then a sound, something subtle, a rustling, as if someone had moved in the darkness behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Slowly I turned my head, fearing what I might find. My whole body tensed. The sound had been soft but unmistakable, as if something or someone was there with me, hidden in the dimness of the empty church. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possibility. The devil comes for those who doubt. Had I become vulnerable by questioning my faith? The pastor always said that evil spirits haunted those who were spiritually weak. And what if that presence was an answer to my uncertainty? My instinct told me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Slowly, I turned around on the pew and looked toward the nave of the church, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The stained glass windows let in a faint light from the street, casting distorted shadows on the floor. There was no one visible, but I knew. I knew I was not alone. My breathing quickened, and I could barely think straight. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to push away the growing dread. Whatever it was, Lord, protect me. My hands trembled as I made the sign of the cross, as if that gesture could anchor me to something real, something secure. But then, the silence was broken again. Another sound, a step, a whisper. My chest tightened. I needed to get out of there. I quickly got up, my mind screaming to run, to escape that suffocating feeling. But as I turned toward the door, I sensed a change in the air, a dense presence, as if something invisible was hovering over me. The fear mixed with something I couldn't quite describe, a weight, a warning, and then a single phrase echoed within me, without sound, without a voice, yet as clear as if it were spoken directly to my heart. You have always been afraid of the wrong thing. My knees nearly buckled. That phrase wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't a sound, wasn't an echo in the empty church. It was something that emerged from within me, but it didn't seem mine. My chest heaved in short, irregular breaths. I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, something told me it wasn't imagination. You have always been afraid of the wrong thing. What did that mean? Hell? The devil? The pastor always said that the greatest mistake a believer can make is to lose the fear of God. But that didn't sound like a reprimand. It wasn't a warning of condemnation. It was as if someone were trying to open my eyes. But to what end? My eyes scanned the altar, the extinguished candles, the cross hanging above the pulpit. I tried to find comfort there, but for the first time, those symbols no longer brought security. On the contrary, they seemed like silent witnesses to a truth I was beginning to understand, yet still reluctant to accept. I took a deep breath, and with hesitant steps, walked to the altar. My hands were cold as I touched the smooth wood of the pulpit, as if that gesture could connect me to God in some way. I closed my eyes. What should I fear? Hell or the lie I had been made to believe about it? A wave of dizziness took over me. My whole life I had strived to be worthy, to follow the rules, to avoid error, because I was told that any slip would lead me straight to perdition. But now, a sharp doubt was infiltrating the very foundations of my faith. What if the real deception was the fear they taught me to carry? What if I had spent years imprisoned by something that should never have had so much power over me? A shiver ran down my spine. My body still trembled, but it wasn't just from fear. It was something deeper, something I couldn't name. As if my soul were being pulled out of the darkness in which it had lived for so long. I looked around, hoping for some physical sign, some visible manifestation of what was happening inside me, but there was nothing but silence. I took a step back, moving away from the altar, feeling a strange mixture of freedom and dread. That phrase still echoed in my mind. You have always been afraid of the wrong thing. But what should I fear, then? I looked up at the cross, illuminated by the faint light of the stained glass, and the answer came with a devastating clarity. I should have never feared condemnation. I should have feared living a faith based on guilt, not on love. A sob escaped my throat, and finally, my legs gave out. I knelt, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because for the first time I felt that I was facing something real. God was not the voice that terrorized me in the sermons. He was the peace I had never allowed myself to feel. For a long time I remained kneeling there, saying nothing, not trying to pray, not seeking answers, just feeling that emptiness within me which, ironically, seemed fuller than ever. As long as I could remember, faith had been presented to me as a bargaining chip. Do this, and God will bless you. Follow that, and He will protect you. But stray, even for an instant, and you are lost forever. I grew up believing that my soul was a minefield, where every misstep could lead to eternal damnation. But now, here on the cold floor of an empty church, I began to understand something that had never been allowed to be questioned. Faith should not be a prison. I wondered how many people felt the same, how many were out there living with this same burden, carrying a fear so deep that they didn't even know who they were without it. Was hell real? I did not know, but the fear of it, yes, that existed, and it had consumed me. For years, shaping my identity, determining every choice I made. I looked at the altar before me, the extinguished candles, the wooden pulpit that, for so long, had been the center of my world. How many sermons had I heard there? How many times had I been warned about the eternal flames, about the inevitable judgment? How many times was I made to believe that my very existence was a test, a tightrope walk over the abyss of hell? I felt a knot tighten in my throat. God is love. At least, that's what they said. But I had never experienced that love genuinely, only the obligation to earn it, as if it were a prize reserved for those who never erred. My mind traveled back to a distant past, to the first time I cried out of fear upon hearing a sermon about condemnation. I was a child, perhaps about 7 years old, and that night I lay awake in bed, trembling, trying to remember all my sins so that I could ask for forgiveness before sleeping. What if I died in my sleep? What if I hadn't repented enough? I spent years living that way, repeating prayers before closing my eyes, not out of devotion, but out of panic. The sense of insecurity never left me. Not even in adulthood. The fear of hell guided me like an invisible shadow, like a chain I never knew I could break. But now, standing there, feeling the echo of that phrase resonate within me, something began to change. Perhaps hell was not a place of flames, a predetermined destiny for those who did not obey blindly. Perhaps hell was exactly this life of fear, this invisible prison that keeps us from feeling the true purpose of faith. I wondered, what if God never intended for me to live like this? The answer came as a whisper from deep within my soul, without the need for words, without any thunderous voice or supernatural revelation, just a quiet certainty, something I had never experienced before. God's love is not a bargain. He does not want you to fear him. He wants you to know him. I closed my eyes and let that truth wash over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't praying out of fear, wasn't desperately seeking forgiveness to rid myself of a suffocating guilt. I was simply existing in that moment, feeling something I never knew I could feel. Peace. Not the fragile kind of peace that comes from following rules, from fitting into impossible expectations. It was a peace that depended on nothing other than simply being there before God, without masks, without promises, without fear. For years, I had been made to believe that my faith was only valid if accompanied by fear and submission. But there, kneeling in the darkness of the church, I realized that perhaps God never wanted me to feel enslaved by religion. And if all he wanted was for me to understand that I was already loved without having to earn it, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of doubt and guilt slowly dissolve. For the first time, I was no longer afraid of losing myself. I felt that perhaps I was already finding myself. I stood up, still trembling, but not from terror. There was something new within me, something I could barely explain. The fear did not vanish completely. How could it, after years of being my only way to perceive faith? But for the first time, it no longer controlled me. I knew that this journey didn't end here. I knew I would still face doubts, that maybe I would feel that old terror again in moments of weakness. But I also knew that there was something beyond that cycle of guilt and punishment. I looked one last time at the cross, not with the old sense of obligation, but with a different understanding, as if I was seeing an old friend I had never truly known. I took a deep breath and left the church. The cold pre-dawn wind touched my face, and this time I did not feel a shiver. For the first time in my life, the silence of the night did not seem like a threat. It wasn't a warning of condemnation, nor a reminder of my insignificance. It was just silence, just peace, just freedom.